You know what's fascinating about studying someone who went from human rights lawyer to prime minister in record time? It's watching them systematically abandon every principle they once claimed to hold dear, like a psychological experiment in real-time moral flexibility. Today we're dissecting the absolutely bewildering mind of Sir Keir Starmer, a man who's managed to make political flip-flopping look like an Olympic sport. Before we start, drop a comment and let me know what other political figures you think desperately need a mental health assessment. I'm always looking for new subjects to wildly speculate about. So, Keir Rodney Starmer, born September 2nd, 1962 in Southwark, London, to a toolmaker father and a nurse mother. Now, you might think growing up in a working-class household would instill certain values about, consistency and keeping your word. He studied law at Leeds University and Oxford, became a barrister specialising in human rights, and even served as Director of Public Prosecutions. Sounds noble, right? The kind of background that suggests someone with unwavering moral principles. Well, hold on to that thought because we're about to explore how someone can go from defending civil liberties to, shall we say, taking a rather different approach to free speech once they get into power. What's particularly fascinating is how Starmer marketed himself during his rise to Labour leadership. He positioned himself as the steady, reliable alternative to the chaos of previous years. The man who would bring back competence and integrity to British politics. It's like watching someone audition for the role of trustworthy leader and then immediately forgetting their lines once they got the part. But before I forget, if you happen to enjoy these semi-professional psychological evaluations, remember to hit that subscribe button, because apparently my unqualified opinions about famous people's personalities are exactly what the internet needed more of. Now you might be wondering, what exactly makes Starmer such a fascinating psychological case study? Well, let me introduce you to what I like to call the Starmer paradox, which is basically the ability to hold completely contradictory positions with the confidence of someone who's never heard of cognitive dissonance. During his leadership campaign, Starmer made 10 clear pledges. 10. Not 9, not 11, but exactly 10 promises that were supposed to define his political identity. These included things like opposing austerity, defending free movement, and maintaining the highest environmental standards. Now here's where the psychology gets really interesting, because what happened next is a masterclass in what we might call strategic amnesia. Within months of becoming leader, Starmer began what can only be described as a systematic dismantling of his own promises. It's like watching someone methodically burn their own manifesto while maintaining perfect eye contact. The environmental pledges quietly dropped. The anti-austerity stance. Suddenly fiscal responsibility became the priority. Free movement? Well, that became rather inconvenient, didn't it? From a psychological perspective, this behaviour suggests someone with what we might call situational ethics. A fascinating condition where moral principles become surprisingly flexible, depending on political convenience. It's the kind of mental gymnastics that would make Olympic contortionists weep with envy. But here's what's really psychologically intriguing about Starmer's approach to promise-keeping. He doesn't just abandon his commitments, he does it with the kind of methodical precision that suggests this isn't impulsive behaviour. This is calculated, deliberate, and executed with the emotional detachment of someone updating their LinkedIn profile. There's something almost clinical about how he can look directly into a camera and explain why his previous position was actually wrong all along. The man has turned political U-turns into an art form. Remember when he said he'd never work with the SNP? Well, that lasted about as long as a chocolate teapot in a heatwave. His approach to changing positions isn't the frantic flip-flopping of someone caught off guard. It's the smooth, practiced pivot of someone who's genuinely comfortable with ideological flexibility. What's particularly fascinating is how he manages to maintain that earnest, slightly wounded expression while explaining why his complete reversal of position is actually the principled thing to do. It's like watching someone explain why up is actually down with the patience of a kindergarten teacher and the conviction of a true believer. Now here's where Starmer's psychological profile gets really interesting, and frankly, a bit concerning. You've probably heard the term two-tier Keir floating around, and while it sounds like a rejected superhero name, it actually points to something quite revealing about his mindset. The whole two-tier controversy emerged from what appeared to be different standards of justice depending on who was involved. During the summer riots of 2024, We saw remarkably swift prosecutions and harsh sentences for some groups, while other incidents seemed to receive rather different treatment. Now, from a psychological standpoint, this suggests someone who's developed what we might call selective moral vision, a condition where identical behaviours are perceived differently based on the perpetrator's identity. What's particularly fascinating is how Starmer, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, seemed genuinely confused by accusations of inconsistent justice. This isn't someone who's consciously trying to be unfair, this is someone who's apparently convinced that their differential treatment is actually perfectly reasonable. It's like watching someone sort people into categories without realising they're doing it. The psychology behind this is actually quite complex. Starmer appears to have developed what cognitive scientists call motivated reasoning, where the conclusion comes first and the justification follows. If you're predisposed to view certain groups as more threatening, then harsher treatment feels not just appropriate, but morally necessary. But here's what's really psychologically revealing about the whole situation. When confronted with evidence of this differential treatment, Starmer's response wasn't introspection or acknowledgement, it was defensive deflection. Classic psychological defense mechanism right there. Instead of examining whether there might be some validity to the criticism, the response was essentially, "How dare you suggest such a thing?" This pattern suggests someone with a rather rigid self-concept, who struggles with criticism that challenges their fundamental self-image. Starmer sees himself as fair, principled, and consistent. Any evidence to the contrary isn't processed as information to consider, it's processed as an attack to be repelled. The former human rights lawyer, who now oversees what many perceive as selective justice enforcement, is such a perfect example of cognitive compartmentalization that it should probably be in psychology textbooks. It's like watching someone who's an expert on nutrition exclusively eat fast food, while explaining why vegetables are essential for health. And then we come to perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of Starmer's tenure, the sudden enthusiasm for arresting people over social media posts. Now remember, this is the same man who built his career defending civil liberties and free speech. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at a dinner party for hypocrites. The psychology behind this transformation is absolutely fascinating. We're watching someone who once argued passionately for the importance of free expression, now overseeing a system where people are literally being arrested for tweets. It's like watching a vegetarian open a butcher shop and then acting surprised when people point out the contradiction. What's particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how Starmer seems to have convinced himself that this crackdown on online speech is actually about protecting people. Classic rationalization in action. The human mind is remarkably good at reframing authoritarian behavior as protective care, and Starmer appears to be a master of this particular mental gymnastics routine. Someone recently asked me if Starmer might have developed what psychologists call authoritarian personality disorder, and honestly, the symptoms are starting to line up like ducks in a row. The rigid thinking, the intolerance for dissent, the belief that strong measures are necessary for the greater good, it's all there wrapped up in the neat package of someone who genuinely believes they're doing the right thing. But here's what's really psychologically disturbing about this whole social media surveillance approach. It's not being implemented with the crude heavy-handedness of an obvious dictator. It's being rolled out with the careful, methodical precision of someone who's thought this through and decided it's perfectly reasonable. That's actually much more concerning from a psychological standpoint, because it suggests someone who's rationalized authoritarianism to themselves. The former human rights lawyer, who now presides over what many are calling a surveillance state, is such a perfect case study in psychological transformation that it's almost too neat to be real. It's like watching someone evolve in real time from defender of civil liberties to someone who apparently believes that liberty is something that needs to be carefully managed by people like him. What's particularly revealing is how he discusses these policies. There's no acknowledgement of the irony, no recognition of how dramatically his position has shifted. It's delivered with the same earnest conviction he once used to defend the very rights he's now curtailing. The psychological compartmentalization required for this level of cognitive dissonance is actually quite impressive in a deeply disturbing way. Now you might be thinking, surely I'm exaggerating when I suggest Starmer has dictatorial tendencies. After all, he was democratically elected, he follows parliamentary procedure, he wears sensible suits. But here's the thing about modern authoritarianism. It doesn't always come with dramatic speeches and military parades. Sometimes it comes with bureaucratic efficiency and the firm belief that dissent is simply inconvenient. The psychological profile that emerges from Starmer's behaviour is someone who's developed what we might call benevolent authoritarianism syndrome. This is the belief that restricting people's freedoms is actually good for them, delivered with the patronising smile of someone who knows better than you do. It's authoritarianism with a human face, which is actually more dangerous than the obvious kind because it's much harder to recognise. What's particularly fascinating is how Starmer seems to have convinced himself that his increasingly authoritarian approach is actually moderate and reasonable. The man who once defended terrorists' rights to fair trials, and continues to do so, now oversees a system where people are arrested for social media posts, and he apparently sees no contradiction whatsoever. The psychological blind spots required for this level of self-deception are actually quite remarkable. Looking at his childhood, growing up in a working-class household with parents who presumably valued hard work and fairness, it's interesting to speculate about what psychological mechanisms led to this particular personality development. Perhaps the early identification with Keir created a grandiose sense of historical destiny. Perhaps the academic success and legal career reinforced a belief in his own moral superiority. Or perhaps power simply revealed character traits that were always there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The transformation from human rights lawyer to someone who many view as increasingly authoritarian is such a perfect case study in how power can corrupt even those who seem most committed to liberal principles. It's like watching someone slowly realise they prefer being the one making the rules rather than defending those who break them. What makes Starmer particularly psychologically interesting is that he doesn't seem to recognise his own transformation. This isn't someone who's consciously chosen to become more authoritarian. This is someone who's convinced themselves that their increasingly restrictive approach is actually the principled position. The level of self-deception required for this is actually quite impressive in a deeply concerning way. So there you have it, the psychological profile of Sir Keir Starmer, a man who's managed to transform from civil rights defender to what many see as an increasingly authoritarian leader, while apparently maintaining complete confidence in his own moral consistency. It's like watching someone become everything they once opposed, while genuinely believing they're staying true to their principles. And that's our completely unauthorised psychological analysis of Britain's current Prime Minister. If you enjoyed this wildly speculative character assassination, don't forget to subscribe for more unqualified opinions about famous people's mental states. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous authoritarians are often the ones who genuinely believe they're protecting you.